Catherine, and I'm happy to be here. Good morning, everyone who's watching out there. Welcome to the first panel and what probably is going to be the most important panel you hear today. And the reason I say that is because I know people like me haven't done as good a job as we should have been doing over the last decade, probably longer, in pulling back the curtain on what's going on around cybersecurity and all the threats that are out there. So I'm really looking forward to hosting this discussion. Just tip my hat on how little I know about it, so I'm going to learn a lot along with the rest of you, I'm sure. Just a quick tour of the table. I won't go deep into bios. They're all out there on the internet. You can find them, but we've assembled a great group of people here. I'll start with Farshad Abbasi. He's the founder and Chief Security Officer of Founder Security. We have Andrew Loeschman, co-founder and CEO of Field Effect. Steve Rainville, CEO of CyDef. I think that's CyDef, Steve, and not CYDEF. And David Shipley, CEO of Beauceron Security. Thanks everyone for being here this morning. I think the first thing we need to do is probably just set the scene. And I'm gonna start with you, Farshad. A comes first in the alphabet, so you're up first. Tell us what it's been like over the last couple of years, how the pandemic and the acceleration toward a digital economy has changed things from your perspective. But maybe even take one step back and just sort of tell us how we got here, because I've been reading a bit about the growing threat or the evolution of cyber warfare. A decade ago, ridiculous stories about the Chinese state trying to break into Google feels to me a bit like trying to crack the Louvre and steal the Mona Lisa, but somehow they almost got away with it. I would have thought, though, given how long we've been dealing with it, the threat must have dissipated a bit by now. The threat showed itself a decade ago, and smart people like you have had 10 years to lock up the doors. So maybe start from there. Tell us how we've evolved over the last decade and how things have changed over the last couple of years.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think about this, as you were asking me the question in my head, I was thinking it's a numbers game. When there's very few things for people to hack, well, there's not enough stuff for them to figure out and hack. As the world has progressed, we're digitally transforming, particularly during the pandemic. As you all know, when everyone was staying home, a lot of companies started to digitally transform their services to make them available to folks. Like the first example that comes to mind is buying groceries or buying food or ordering various online goods. During the pandemic, a lot of companies very quickly shifted to digital transformation, and that means more software out there. That means more software for attackers to play around or attack. So Verizon produces a data breach report. Their report said that in 2020, the number of attacks on web applications alone doubled in compared to the previous year. Primarily, that's because there's just more of them. And when there's more of them, there's more stuff to attack. Now, why haven't we figured those things out? Because also technology's evolved quite a bit. The types of attacks that were prevalent, say 10 or 15 years ago, aren't the sort of things that are prevalent today. Another contributing factor, and this is what was highlighted in one of those reports that came out, was that prior to the pandemic, a fair number of criminal actors were taking action in the physical world. For example, they were printing fake credit cards, going to shopping malls and use them. When the shopping malls were closed, guess where the criminal activity focused? Well, they stayed at home and focused on online attacks, right? So you've got those various numbers, right? More people staying, more criminal actors staying at home and performing attacks digitally. More companies providing opportunities for those attackers by creating digital services. So I think that's essentially a summary of what's been happening and why there's an increasingly number of attacks out there.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll give each of you a chance to sort of describe how things have evolved, and I'll go to you next, Andrew. Maybe you can pick up on something though that Farshad said. He talked about how attacks have changed. So tell us a bit how the landscape has changed from your perspective. But maybe if you could pick up on that point. So how did the cyber attacks used to happen, and how are they happening now?
Sure. Very interesting question. So I think you were referencing the Aurora attacks on Google probably more than 10 years ago now at this point. And when you looked at the cyber threat landscape at that point in time, we were mostly concerned about nation state actors, those governments that have the resources, capability, pardon me, and patience to execute very sophisticated attacks. What we've seen over the last 10 years is a transition where cyber criminals, which used to be looked at as more or less a nuisance with low-grade capabilities, low-grade skills, and very little patience, they've transitioned to have capabilities far more similar to what we used to consider at nation state level. And this has happened for a few reasons. Part of it is that we've, of course, had some very interesting data leaks from national security agencies that led to attacks that we saw on shipping lines, NotPetya, Maersk, whether that was incidental or not. A lot of that was rooted in nation state tradecraft that made its way out onto the internet. The other thing that's really come about is that cyber criminals have discovered that they can convert your information and your network security into dollars. That's partly been enabled by the rise in cryptocurrency and the ability to transact digitally and move money around the world. However, there's been a few playbooks that have been well understood and well executed by cyber criminals to figure out how to move money out of bank accounts or to drive ransomware incidents to a point where they understand the network, they understand who they're attacking, and they're able to exert pinpoint pressure on the dentists, the Fortune 100 companies, the automobile dealerships, to figure out exactly how much they can pay. And so in that regard, they are much more like nation state actors, far more capable, patient, and they're automating their tradecraft. A lot of people think, I can't be affected. Well, the news is that cyber criminals automate what it is they do, and they don't necessarily care who you are, but if you have a vulnerability, they will find it, and then they'll figure out how much money you have to give them.
All right. Steve, your turn. Again, share any observations that you have, given how you see the context sort of shifting through the pandemic, and maybe pick up on that idea of vulnerabilities. And what are the, after you sort of give your sense of how things have evolved, maybe you could pivot and talk about the vulnerabilities that exist there, some of the most obvious ones.
Thanks, and I guess to add to Andrew and Farshad, it's all a question also of acceleration, right? With the digital transformation, businesses have to find ways to survive, right? So it's that race to the market. I need to adapt. I'm a restaurateur. I can't have customers over. I'm going to go online. I'm going to offer deliveries. I need a website. How do I process all of this? But it's speed to market. I just need to adapt. And we don't have that reflex yet of it has to be secure by default. And that's not really a concern. I need my business to survive. And oh, by the way, yes, I might need some security there. So the vulnerabilities and everything else, the businesses aren't concerned. That's not the first reflex, right? They are trusting the partners and the experts that build me a website, add some transactional capabilities. I need to do this, connect to different partners. And everyone unfortunately assumes that everyone knows their role to play and whatnot, but cybersecurity is often, it'll be tacked on, or it's somewhere in the contract, right? So we will build that. And that's why I think with everyone on this panel, we've built successful businesses because of that as well, right? It's none of the technologies just come safe by default. And as everyone is adapting, both on the technology and on the business side, we're creating new ways to connect, new ways to offer services that, as we were mentioning before, offers different ways and different avenues for cyber criminals to either use the technology or use people, right? What's your business process to contact customers? How do you process your payments? Do you have manual systems? Do you need to talk to someone? Well, that gives the opportunity for someone to call you up and say, by the way, something was, there's a problem with the payment. I need you to reprocess, these changes. We've changed our bank account information. So phishing has become more sophisticated. There's a lot more techniques out of there. And so you need cybersecurity awareness training. There's, the vulnerabilities just keep evolving. The other thing that's also that keeps evolving in the landscape, and especially in the last 10 years, is criminals have built these networks and automation and tools, but they share the capabilities, and they're now specialized in each. So someone is specialized in a certain type of vulnerability. Someone has built a network to distribute and find and pinpoint those vulnerabilities. How can I use them? And everyone shares in those profits. So one, it makes it more difficult for law enforcement and everyone, because now it's a global problem. I don't have, a small team in whatever country using this attack. It's an actual distributed network. So how do I, catch them? How do I stop that problem? If we can just, it's a whack-a-mole game at this point. You stop one, someone else will come up because the techniques still work. So that's the continuous challenge. And part of the also the challenge and the wake-up call that I think we've been doing for probably 10, 20 years now in cybersecurity, to say this is a concern now that businesses are going more and more into the digital economy. It can't just be an afterthought. It has to be those questions that we go forward with. I'm doing some transformation. How secure is this, and what are the risks? Right? Because there's no, you can't get to zero risk. But what do business owners do? Service line leaders, anyone in digital transformation, do they understand the risk? Whether it's to the company directly, to their customer data, their reputation, but they have to have that conversation.
All right, thanks. David, your turn. What's your observation from where you sit? Do companies understand the risk?
No, because we don't even understand the problem appropriately. If you ask everyone in the audience, what does the word cyber even mean? I mean, we're here talking about cybersecurity, and people will stop and they'll give a variety of different answers. And I'll tell you what it actually means. It means people in control of technology. It was chosen by scientists at MIT when they developed the field of cybernetics to describe that relationship. It's from a Greek word, kybernetes. And Steve hit on this really well. It's about people. It's about processes. It's about culture. And remember, humans are terrible at risk assessment. If we actually properly understood risks, we wouldn't do a lot of the things that we do. But and business leaders and entrepreneurs, we actually have to be almost purposely terrible at being paralyzed by risk, because we take chances all the time. But the problem is we make uninformed decisions about the risk. And to some of the points about the earlier panelist conversation, it's not that we should have solved this problem by 10 years ago. It's become orders of magnitude worse. We're spending $150 billion globally, and our losses, depending on which estimate you want to pick, are somewhere between $2 trillion and $10 trillion. That's anywhere between the complete equivalent of Canada's GDP and 4x our GDP. So we're spending more money than ever, and we're doing worse than ever. In any other business logic, we would stop and say, what the hell are we doing? But we haven't. We haven't stopped, slowed down, and said, the basics is where we often get tripped up. The other point I want to add, it goes to the cybercrime economy. This is a sophisticated multi-billion-dollar industry. We just had a Canadian convicted and sentenced to 80 months. He was a federal government IT worker. He was a Russian cybercrime gang's top affiliate. So he was the guy working the actual scams, using the criminal tools out there, victimized 17 plus organizations, and was sitting on $30 million. So criminals follow the money. The money is going online, and criminals love to go to the places where the police aren't. And the police in this country are not even remotely resourced to help with online crime.
I want to get to the policy response to some of this in a bit later in the conversation. But honestly, David, you're kind of freaking me out. I'm left with, after hearing your remarks, there's sort of a feeling of hopelessness. I'm not sure entirely what someone in my position or a small business can do against a threat as you've described it. Where do you begin? I mean, I'm tempted to give up and just cross my fingers. But is there a better strategy than that? I'll sort of throw that across the table. We can start with David. I mean, what's your best advice on how you respond to a threat of that magnitude?
So there is always hope. I mean, the last thing that I want to leave people with is a sense of fear and paralysis. But you have to have that come to the table conversation, that frank analysis that, okay, this is real and it's going to keep getting real. And also, what can I do in the realm of operating my business? Because when we deal with our clients, we're a cybersecurity company. They are companies in finance, banking, telecommunications. Their goal is to deliver products and services to customers. They're not security companies, but they have to do that securely. So how do we help them take the wins and gradually lower their risk? And I'm from New Brunswick, and I'll make the joke. Sometimes it's not about outrunning the bear; it's outrunning everybody else the bear is chasing. And so incremental improvement does, help you make yourself a little bit safer. And there are lots of things we can do as businesses that do require investments. And I am the co-chair for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's Cyber Right Now campaign that's going to the federal government saying, listen, business needs some help to make the investments they need to secure themselves. They can't do this alone. Some of that is financial, and some of that is policy and resources, and starting to hit back at some of these criminal gangs. But until we can have the conversation where we actually know what the words we're using mean, know what the threat actually is out there, and can actually take appropriate steps as individuals, businesses, and governments, that's when we don't have hope. But I think this conversation and many others are changing that story.
Steve, what's your best advice? Why shouldn't I just take out some insurance against this threat, or assume that either my bank or the Googles and Amazons of the world will take care of me, given that combination basically controls all the money on the planet anyway? Why should I assume that this is something that I need to take care of?
Good question. And the insurance route is certainly something that everyone should investigate. However, as we're seeing, and David was talking about the losses, insurance firms aren't there to lose money. So the criteria, and for them, it's an operational risk. So what's the operational risk? They are going to improve, their due diligence, and how do you get approved for coverage, and also add restrictions. What are those conditions and under which you can make a claim? And this is getting to the point of, well, if you don't have a cybersecurity program, again, we're going back to the chicken and the egg. If you're a small business owner, you don't have cybersecurity expertise. How do you get the security program? How do you get those best practices in place if you need coverage? So you do need external help. I think that's going to have to come with some policy, but it's the basics. How do we improve? There's two sides of that, and you do need some basic awareness. You need to understand what you're getting into, and not being afraid of asking the questions. I think that's part of what we all need to do. Is we feel vulnerable because we don't know. And I think at this point, a lot of the technology is like, even for myself with my electric car, right? If I had to do any type of maintenance on that, I can't, right? So what do? I need to go back to a specialist and ask questions, right? I know nothing about the car and really how the internal, all of this works out. We need to do and have those conversations with specialists amongst ourselves, and not being afraid of, I don't have this. I don't understand. What are the vulnerabilities? What are the risks? And asks those open questions. But then on the flip side is also take actions, right? It's saying, I have these issues. I need to invest. I need to put in the time and the effort to work with people that will do that for me, and get to that level that I need to be. I think also from an industry practice, the technology, if it's bad and it leads to vulnerabilities, we often talk about doing the basics, and one of the basics that everyone likes to talk about is passwords. Why are passwords, and we're now saying that passwords, the complexity is really because of computing power. It's all about the length of the password. It's no longer uppercase, lowercase, and all of these crazy requirements. I need a password that's realistically 14, 16, 20 characters long. That isn't easy for a human to remember, right? So we can put the technology. Again, why are our pieces of software that we use, why don't they adapt to that? Why do we still have technology that doesn't properly encrypt your information? Why is that even an option for a system administrator that sets up an environment and can use the wrong parameters? Remove those parameters. Don't make it possible to make bad choices. So I think from a software perspective, we need to improve that approach, and it's the general awareness for everyone, and actually apply what we keep saying is the basics. I think just my last thought here is think about this for with cars and the seatbelts. Huge campaigns, wear your seatbelt, it saves lives, and this and that. The seat belts now comes, they're standard in every car. We all have airbags. It's not an option really that you go and say, is my car 5-star rated for accidents and things like that? They have crumple zones. They have all of this. It's built into the car. No one is thinking about all of these security features. You're no longer concerned. You assume your car is safe. We need to bring the digital environment into that. And obviously car makers just didn't do that on their own. It was partly with rules and regulations, but it has to be the whole ecosystem that adapts.
Okay, Farshad, I'm going to come to you next. I'm going to save some of the audience questions till the end, but one has popped up already that sort of runs along with what we're talking about now. And this audience member wants to know, or wants some insight on what you can do to get companies to focus in on these problems, to understand the problem and the risk that's out there. I mean, we're circling around it, but what do you do to get that smaller business or that medium-sized business out there that is trying to do a dozen things a day and has probably 15 things on which it could spend its money? How do you get them to zero in on the importance of spending some time thinking about cybersecurity?
You get them to zero in. I think there's a couple of challenges. Traditionally, there's been no guidance for small companies. They often say, well, what do I do for cybersecurity? There are frameworks for cybersecurity, but they're usually very heavy and they're designed for large organizations, right? One that comes to mind is the NIST cybersecurity framework. I had to deal with that when I used to work at a bank, and it takes a long time to go through. It's very detailed. Doesn't really make sense for a small business to try to achieve that. There are other, another common framework is the Center for Information Security. They have the critical security controls framework. Again, very heavy framework, not really designed for a small business. The good news is that a couple of years ago, the government of Canada put out a document called the Baseline Cybersecurity Controls for Small and Medium Businesses. It's a lighter framework that's designed for small and medium businesses. So that's something that they could leverage. It's available online by searching for it, and it's got some very good actionable areas. But I think another fundamental problem is that lack of understanding. I think Dave mentioned that the cyber world is out there, the police aren't there, so it's a perfect opportunity for criminals. I'll add to that not only are the police not present, but every store doesn't have the alarms or any of the security mechanisms that a regular retail store would think of immediately, right? Like if you're opening up a brick and mortar, the first thing you're going to put is an alarm system, some sort of bars that when you close shop, you can protect your store, and a bunch of other security. That's never questioned. That's automatically a part of your retail build. But when they go and build software online, which is their virtual representation, they don't really budget for security at all. Often is not even thought of. So that shift in mentality needs to happen. Like, why do we as humans automatically think of putting the alarm system in our retail store and putting bars and having locks and all sorts of things, and we budget for it? That's just there's no question about it if you're opening a brick and mortar. But when we go do that in the virtual world, there's not even a thought about given to that. Another challenge is, and I think this comes from education, is that when people are building software, they're not really considering potential for malware. An example of an opposite example of that is when you have a desktop computer, and I'm sure most of you right now have some sort of anti-malware installed on your computer. We don't really question that. We say, hey, we've got a desktop machine. Company says you got to put anti-malware on there, and we got to keep that up to date. Why do we do that? Because there's new zero-day malware and viruses that come out almost every day. So without question, we install that antivirus and we update it every day. However, when we build software, no one even thinks of that. At best, they'll come to a company like ours for an annual pen test. That's the equivalent of turning on your antivirus once a year and checking your computer and turning it off for the rest of the year. We're not regularly checking software for viruses or malware or zero-day. That's not even a thought. So that shift in mentality needs to happen, that in the virtual world, it's this, you're a retailer, as in my example, you're selling goods online. That's the same thing as if you had a brick and mortar. So you need to budget for security, and you need to go and install the virtual equivalent of the same controls that you have in your physical world. And there are guidances, as I mentioned, this baseline cybersecurity controls for small, medium businesses. And another good news is that there's help. So, the Canadian government has got funds through programs like INSECM and IRAP that can help provide funding for companies that want to go and improve their cybersecurity and get certified with a framework such as the one that I mentioned.
Okay, Andrew, you next. A question that's popped into my mind through this conversation is, okay, if I'm a business owner out there, I mean, I get it. This is a serious threat, but where do I find the money to do this? I mean, do I just have to find the money? Do I have to raise my prices? What is the, what are those sorts of barriers like? Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, not necessarily asking you to give away your prices here online today, but what is the cost barrier for a smaller business to properly protect itself?
The world in which small businesses, and in fact all businesses, are operating is one of competitiveness. They set out in this world to do something different, provide a service, build a product, and that's where their time and effort is focused on. And where I think, in particular, a lot of SMEs struggle is that they don't understand the problem, and therefore they can't make a good calculation as to how much they should invest, whether that's time or money or otherwise. I don't think the cybersecurity industry has done a really great job to date about providing context and explaining this. It's a little bit like arriving at the airport and being asked if you'd like your flight with no safety, safety plus, or safety extreme. And by the way, if you sign up for the credit card right now, we'll also consider safety for the engines. It's sort of like, what are we doing here? And I think that this manifests in some pretty striking ways. I'm looking right now at a report. We talked about cyber insurance, and insurers are looking at their portfolio and saying, look, we got a ton of risk here, and we're not going to be able to pay out all these claims. And so they're starting to deny insurance. They're saying, look, your security levels aren't high enough for us to be able to insure you because you're that much of a risk. And the report I'm looking at is striking in the sense that, number one, many businesses across the board, save for a few like defense contractors who are thinking about this problem more seriously, have some pretty blatant and obviously discoverable vulnerabilities when scanned for. The other piece that I think is pretty striking and be worth having a conversation around is that Canadian businesses versus US businesses have twice the rate of vulnerabilities discovered per business. And I think we're using the same technology, we're just across the border. So why is that? And it goes back to your question, which is, do businesses understand that this is a problem they have? Do they understand that this is something that they must do something about? And given that they must do something about it, where do they start? And there have been some great suggestions here already. Going to the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity is a good first non-commercial resource for you to begin reading and understanding if that's what you need to do. And there's some excellent guidance and step-by-step guides to get you started as an SME there. But certainly seeking advice and working with a trusted partner, whether that's a service provider or some of the folks here on the panel here today, is a great way to help demystify what's going on in cybersecurity. And that's a real challenge, and I would say a first step.
I want to get the policy conversation going before we run out of time. I'm going to start with you on that one, David, and I might come right back to you, Andrew, because I know you have some policy background, judging by your bio, so I'm probably get you to get into that perspective. But I'll give you a break since you just gave us some good insight there. David, what's the policy response? I mean, we're talking about this as a war quite often. That metaphor is we've used it here. I see it all the time when we're talking about cybersecurity. We as individuals don't go out and fight our own wars, at least not anymore. We rely on the government and authorities to do that for us. So is that really something that the government should just step up and take care of? Do we need a more rigorous policy response?
So I'm going to divide up my answer in a couple of sections. So there's national security policy, and that is, how are we going to respond to international gangs and groups that are sometimes tied to nation states, or actually the nation states themselves, whether the attack crews are freelancing after hours doing ransomware attacks, or it's part of the mission to generate money for that particular state. creating new norms, creating new coalitions, creating new capabilities to go back. And I mean, the Americans have done a phenomenal job since the colonial pipeline of punching back and also creating relationships with law enforcement in other countries to go after the criminals. Like, you can't have a group that can just launch attacks with absolute impunity, make billions of dollars in revenues, and expect that we can defend our ways out of this. So what is the right balance? And I will say, attribution's really hard. Figuring out who did what in the digital space is tricky, but it's where the federal government plays a unique and important role. There's also the policing responsibility. So there are Canadians that are tied into these international groups. So more money for the RCMP and others, and a specific mandate and a refinement of our policing response. We don't necessarily need cops carrying guns anymore so much as carrying iPhones and keyboards, and really helping and expanding that capability. But it's not just about the cybersecurity offense or policing side. How do we help small businesses afford things? How do we give clear guidance? We've started to do that, but create ways of subsidizing some of that. Again, not 100-cent dollars here, but ways of helping offset those costs, looking at models like what we've done with climate change and other things with the energy retrofit programs, et cetera. So are there ways of helping the businesses that need it the most to, as the analogy said, take that retail store online and add the alarm system and add the bars and the security? And then the third thing that I want to focus on, and this goes back to the, I don't want to be the doom and gloom guy, is the hope. Canada is an amazing player in the cybersecurity innovation space. You've got folks on the line here. All of these companies are growing significantly. They're serving customers around the world. We're creating jobs and wealth here back in Canada. We have a great story about Canadian innovation, and the world loves Canada. So how do we invest in made in Canada cybersecurity technologies so that we can do what we're great at, playing a disproportionate role protecting the planet? We did it with peacekeeping, and now we can do it with cybersecurity. So there are policy choices we can make on that side.
Andrew, so back to you, and feeding on your experience on the policymaking side of this. What's the right balance here? Is this something where government needs to step up? Should we stand back and just, as we alluded to earlier in the conversation, just let the Googles and the Amazons fight the Russians and the Chinese or whoever out there is raining malware down on us? Or is there another approach? Just what's your perspective?
I think there's an absolute role for the government and legislative action in all of this, or at least regulatory. I think it's a well-known and understood phenomenon that government and legislation always lags technology, and cybersecurity is no different in this regard. I think what we're seeing in the US is particularly interesting. If you look at Biden's executive order from middle of last year around cybersecurity, I think it lays out a pretty compelling framework for how governments might look at establishing national standards and baselines for what's expected out of businesses across the country. And this ties back into economic prosperity. With opportunity in the digital world comes cybersecurity risk. And you'll note that in Biden's EO that they talk about accelerating adoption of the cloud and technology, not shying away from it. And it's really taking that bold approach that says, look, we need to be using IT. We need to embrace more to succeed in the digital economy. And what we need to have are things like mandatory reporting and disclosure when there are breaches, and making sure that that's an efficient and useful process, to ensure that there are minimum standards that must be abided by businesses across the country, because we're starting to see that maybe an organic market-based approach isn't functioning. And then also to be articulate about what guidance and support and clarity around what's important for businesses. And we do see that in some regard from like we've been talking about the Center for Cybersecurity, but really boiling that down into basics and saying, look, as a country, we need to succeed in the digital economy, and this is what we expect as a baseline from everyone.
All right, thanks. Steve, there's a question from the audience about whether we know the goals or the objectives of the state actors that we read so much about being the big threat there. I wonder if you could take that one, but maybe as you do so, maybe just like parse out the threat levels. I mean, we focus in on how the state actors, but I guess it's as we've discussed, it's more than that. There's cyber gangs out there. I suppose there are even individuals taking advantage of the technology to poke away and see what they can get away with. So just maybe take all those threads and just maybe set the scene, and just who are you and everybody on this panel and your peers battling with day in and day out?
I'll stay away from nation states and their motivations and whatnot. I'll humbly say that it's not my area of expertise. Really my background has always been as a defender. And I guess to continue the store analogy, it's really working with a team of loss prevention, and whatever your motivation is to steal something and leave with, whether it's a piece of clothing or whatnot, or digital information, right? It's your personal information, credit card, or customer information. I've always been on the side of how do we better protect ourselves, and the motivations. I think we mentioned earlier, it's the money, right? They are following that, and how can that disrupt? We do have the example of Colonial Pipeline, where they can actually do physical disruptions. It can be on critical infrastructure, and attacking that and crippling a whole nation or part of a nation and whatnot. If we think about attacking the electrical grid. Everything is going digital. Everything runs on electricity. That's a huge sector that needs to be addressed. So the cyber criminals or the warfare around that could be part of those motivations, but mostly it's really all about the money. It's easy. They were mentioning that law enforcement and the coalitions are lagging behind, and so it's technically easy money. Again, a Canadian sitting on $30 million, it's eventually almost like the Breaking Bad series. I have too much cash, I don't know where to hide it. That's probably more the challenge is how do I take all the money that I'm getting, those techniques of converting that into cash that I can actually spend, but acquiring the money through ransomware is relatively trivial today with all the vulnerabilities. So I'd say that is the primary motivation for most of these attacks here.
All right, thanks. Farshad, I want to give you a chance to add to the policy question before we go to a few more questions from the audience. Do you have any thoughts there? What's your perspective on that?
In terms of government policy, yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be the right balance. There are things, as I think Dave mentioned, that should be handled at the policy and national level. I think I was trying to think of another analogy because I like physical world analogies, and I'm like, when you're building a physical store, going back to that example, there are certain things that are regulated. You can't not put a fire protection system or sprinkler system. That's regulated. Whether you put that alarm system, that's your choice. If you don't want to put an alarm system and someone breaks into your store, that's not regulated. But the fire system is regulated because you'll die. So I think it needs to be a balance between policy for areas that really matter, that protect the consumer at that level. For example, when there's a breach, when there was a breach with Equifax, all of our credit history, the most sensitive information got exposed. Those companies need to be under regulation. If a company is handling such sensitive matters or information that will impact us in that level of extreme, using the fire and death example, then there needs to be a policy and regulation. But where there is, then some of the rest of it needs to be left to the businesses to do a risk assessment. But again, businesses need to be aware that there is a risk. I think someone mentioned earlier that they're just not aware. They just don't really understand what this whole cyber thing is about, and they don't really have a sense of what could happen to them. So I think it's partly education and partly policy.
All right, thanks. Really good question just popped up from the audience, and I'm going to go to David, who's from New Brunswick. I'm also from New Brunswick. The question is about the urban-rural divide. Because being from New Brunswick, I know a bit about how difficult it can be to get a good signal in large swaths of that province. So David, take that one up. I mean, if you're stuck out in rural New Brunswick, where you're basically dependent on Elon Musk to get you a half decent internet signal, how do you protect yourself against a cyber threat? I mean, I suppose the reverse is that a cyber criminal can't get at you either, but I think it's a good question. So what do you do in that case where you just you can't you don't have the access to the same tools, the same tech that we take for granted in the cities?
Well, I don't think that the internet speed connectivity necessarily plays that large of a role in how you protect yourself. Most businesses that say are like ours offering services to to everything like the biggest banks on the planet, our stuff is backed into Microsoft's cloud, for example. So we have global class infrastructure. I'm fortunate my business is connected to fiber. I still am a major proponent of as much fiber as far as we can get to everyone as possible, because all of the other solutions for that last mile are compromises in various ways. So for me, in a province that adopted a specific policy of making sure everyone had access to electricity as a bridging that urban rural divide, I think it's really important that we push that fiber. And Olds, Alberta is a classic example of a community that was just overlooked, and they together put in gigabit fiber for their community as a cooperative investment. So there's economic development opportunities that come with greater access to fiber. You get access to remote work, you get, productivity aspects to it. Security wise, not so much, and maybe defer to some of my other colleagues on that. I think, just to circle back on the policy side, just briefly, I just wanted to go back to that because internet speeds are kind of on the policy side. If we didn't have a fire code today, we would have death traps in downtown Toronto for businesses and high rises. We have a national building code for a reason. So there is a role for policy to give business owners that baseline and that education, just like there is a role to make sure we actually have equitable access, because digital economy is the future. The criminals get it, and we need to do it, and we'll need to do it after the pandemic as well.
All right, thanks. Steve, we accelerated into the digital economy because of the pandemic. What's it feel like now? I mean, is that acceleration just continuing to accelerate? Is it now slowing down a bit, becoming more manageable? Another question here, just like given the adoption of crypto, fintech, all this stuff that we're seeing every day. I mean, it feels, I guess, on one hand that it's only speeding up, but maybe people like you, maybe the policymakers are keeping pace. So just what's that look like from where you sit?
I wouldn't say policymakers are keeping pace. We've had privacy challenges forever, and that's just one part of policymaking. So no, I don't think they're keeping up. For the acceleration, it's not slowing down in my mind. And I think we were talking about connectivity and talking about fiber and whatnot, but with the advent of 5G, every manufacturer of anything that we have, we're going to figure out. Now we're going with little tags and whatnot. Everything is going to be connected, so we're going to find new and interesting ways to use the technology to connect everything, which will increase risk, which will bring the good and the bad. Is as we discover new ways to use the technology and connect eventually everything, we keep accelerating and find new ways. So I think it's good for business. It's going to provide new opportunities for everyone. At the same time, that's going to bring new risk. And we're going to have policies that adapt to that. And that's where, I completely agree. We need guardrails for businesses to be able to follow. I think maybe a different strategy also is to think about there's the policy side of the business owners. But again, we're putting the onus on a business owner to figure out how, especially in this digital world, how to use the tools or get them configured properly so they're secured. And we also need to think about the actual vendors, the people that are building these parts of technology. Is you have to put policies around to say it has to be built securely. The options that are unsafe, just don't put them in, right? That those should be the parts, as well as if I'm building this device and if I put batteries in it that explode, that's a problem. There are regulations and testing mechanisms to make sure that this doesn't happen, and you have to do recalls when that's not safe. So I think as we build software and we're building more and more of this technology, secure by default has to be part of that, and figuring out what are the right guardrails to require from vendors to implement those safeguards.
Farshad, how far are we away from that sort of security? Safe by default makes sense to me. I would like to think that the tech I'm buying is secure. I'm learning from this discussion it's probably not. Are there technology solutions like coming down the pipe that we just haven't seen yet that is going to make this digital economy we're building more secure, or is there a lag?
Things are coming along, but very slowly. I'll give you an example by secure by default. Microsoft Windows over 10 years ago, if you bought one and you installed it by default, you would have administrator level access to everything that was on there. But now when Microsoft ships their product, they don't do that. They don't make the regular user have administrator level. They don't enable guest users. They've put a lot of they've configured a lot of things to be secure by default. Is there room to do better? Yes, there's still room to do a lot better, but things are coming along slowly. The manufacturers are waking up. Large enterprises like Microsoft and Amazon are providing guidelines in terms of how to make their products more secure by default. There are small steps being made, but I think there's still a lot of area for improvement. In the software world, there's a lot of frameworks that are coming on that are encouraging organizations to do security by design rather than as an afterthought. There's the term that a lot of folks might have heard of is shift left. Shift left meaning that build security early on in the life cycle of the application, which is the left side. The left side being the inception of the application, the right side being the operational. Historically, we've waited until the software went into operation, found the flaws, and then we'd be like, well, now we have to fix it, which is going to be quite costly. In fact, there are statistics that show that that's about 30 times more expensive to fix software later when it's been deployed, because you have to patch it, you have to retroactively go and fix a lot of problems. So by shifting that mentality to the left side as early as possible, we bring about more secure software that's been built so by design. And of course, providing those secure defaults to the consumer so that when they enable your software, they've got more. Now, the challenge with having security by default is that security is often a hindrance. So what you observe is even companies like Amazon, they could deliver their services with security by default configuration, but they don't do that purposely because they want a higher rate of adoption. Because if the security features are turned on, it's going to be a lot more difficult for developers to figure these things out. So they disable all that stuff and let the developers go at it and adopt their systems more rapidly. But then the developers often don't go back retroactively and secure those settings. So that's a challenge in and of itself.
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left, maybe 6. I got an excellent question that just popped up that'll work well as a wrap. I'm going to go to you, Andrew. You're next on my screen, at least. I don't know what it looks like to everybody else out there, but you're next on my screen. And then I'll go back to you, David, and then Steve. And if there's time left, Farshad, I'll go to you. If we end up getting cut off, apologies in advance, but you just talk, so I'll give you a break. So Andrew, I mean, the question is essentially, and take this how you want, but it's just sort of a last attempt to try to crystallize everything we're talking about. This person is asking, what are the top 5 things businesses should do to just prepare themselves, gird themselves for against these threats, or where a small business should start, and how to figure out who it can trust. Yeah,
that big question in a few words there. Let me see here. 5. Okay. I think the first thing to do is decide that you are investing in cybersecurity that's important to you. So first of all, you got to decide that this is something you're doing. If you're a little bit nerdy, like those of us that are up here, certainly do some reading, read the baseline controls. What that'll do, it'll lay a foundation for you, some comfort, so that you don't feel that you're navigating in a fog of doubt or uncertainty. And so that will help you get some basics and understanding about what the problem is and what you should be doing about it. In terms of trust, I would say don't be afraid to ask your peer companies, your partners, maybe your supply chains, who they work with, and if they like their security providers, and if they do, then why, and understand that. If that's not available to you, maybe you probably have somebody that's working for you in an IT department, or maybe use an MSP or managed service provider. You should ask them whether or not you are doing enough for cybersecurity. And if the answer comes back yes or no, ask them why, and be confident. You should be able to understand the answer, and you should be able to relate to the answers they give you. And if they don't, then you should take a look at other directions, or maybe challenge back. But don't be persuaded by technobabble. You should be able to understand what it is that you need to be doing. Then in terms of the solutions, I would say when you're out there, it should solve the problem for you. You shouldn't feel like you're assembling a bunch of technologies and trying to mysteriously piece them together. It shouldn't be a business stopper for you cost-wise. You no longer have to look at buying what the Fortune 100 or the fortunate 100 in the world have to invest in for cybersecurity. And you shouldn't have to invest in a giant team to run it. It should be something that once you have a solution, that it should more or less take care of itself. I guess finally, if we're going to get to point number 5, practical things, probably the same thing everybody else here says. Enable MFA, multi-factor authentication, wherever you can, patch and update your systems, and use a password manager.
Well done, Andrew. I didn't think you were going to get to 5, but you did it. Excellent. I'm not going to make anybody else try to get to 5. That's too high a bar to clear. David, maybe take that trust question first, and then, of course, if you want to add anything else, do so. But if I'm a small business or a medium-sized business or whoever I might be, and I'm interested in your securities, why should I be confident that that your company knows what it's doing, or how can I know that you know what you're doing?
Look to really good certifications like the ISO 27001 is what my company adopted. And so it's an ISO certification that actually we attest to the protection of customer data. And these are auditable, understood frameworks. So it goes beyond just like the NIST framework, which is a guideline, to actually being certified and audited. SOC 2 Type 2 is another example of a cybersecurity framework that's audited for control. So look for those things. And when I look at cloud providers, I look to see if they have a security landing page and see what they do. How often do they pen test? How often do they do their security disclosures? What are their, do they do software development lifecycle? Do they have ISO? So that's how you establish trust. And that's how you see the investment in cybersecurity reap benefits, because you can differentiate your business. We do business based on trust. I will add to the excellent points. Multi-factor authentication, as was mentioned earlier, can reduce your risk of what happened to CRA, which was brute force credential stuffing, by 99.9%. So get on the MFA religion today. Like, it's a pain sometimes to turn on. Once you got it up and running, I guarantee it'll save your bacon. Password managers, you cannot remember all the passwords you have in your head. And honest to God, the security industry sometimes gives conflicting advice. If you want to use an online password manager, we have a phenomenal Canadian company. 1Password just raised $650 million. They're doing some cool stuff. There's other ones out there. You can do your research. If you're a small business owner and your threat model is more online hacking and you can't remember all your passwords, get a password book and put it in your safe. But don't try and reuse the same password all over the place. Finally, train your team. Your team is your greatest asset, and you need to teach them about cybersecurity on a regular basis. Don't do it just once, because I can tell you your click rates on real phishing emails will be much higher if you just do it once or you never do it. 30% of people in an organization that don't get training on phishing will fall victim. And I'll get you in 5 minutes if I'm a criminal. So teach your people, teach yourself, and make smart investments.
All right, about 30 seconds left. Steve, I'm going to give it to you. Sorry, Farshad. You're making some great gestures in the background, though, so everybody knows what to approve of or what not to. But thanks so much for doing this with us. Thanks, everybody. Steve, those last 30 seconds or so belong to you. What's your best 1 or 2 points on how a company can decide, what it needs to do first when it comes to dealing with these cyber threats?
Find a trusted partner. I think we were talking about that, and having those conversations. If to Andrew's earlier point, if it sounds like gibberish, move away, move on, talk to someone else. Any partner that's just pushing, the solution and forgetting about the conversation, what your business needs are, again, wrong conversation. I've spent now most of my time doing security awareness and helping industries understand their risks more than what do we provide as continuous monitoring, right? Is it a fit? Is it a requirement? Take the time to learn and talk with potential partners.
All right. Thanks for doing that, Steve. Hopefully I'm not cutting this off too abruptly. I want to thank again all of you for participating. I'm a little less freaked out by all this now after chatting with you for roughly an hour than maybe I was at the very beginning. So really appreciate you taking your time this morning. Excellent conversation. So next up, there's a one-on-one interview between the Chamber President and CEO Perrin Beatty and Tim McMillan, also President CEO of, not also President CEO of the Chamber, but President CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And after that, a second fireside chat with Zoom CEO Arpana Bawa. Sorry. Thanks everyone again for participating. Thank you to the audience, and hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.